Hello, wherever you are. My name's Laura Walker McDonald, and this is actually a rehearsal for a keynote that I'll be delivering later today in Melbourne, in Australia, for the annual Connecting Up conference, which is a conference for nonprofits in Australia who are using technology in their work. And the keynote is going to be about an hour. But I thought that since they're not going to be able to video it, they've given me permission to record a version of the talk, which we can share online for those of you who couldn't make it, or for those of you who want to see how far the two versions of the talk differ, which is an absolutely fair question. So without further ado, I'll get going. So it's an interesting conference to attend, this one. Lots of organizations who are clearly focused on technology or use technology very heavily. Some others that don't, and for whom technology is part of their operations. What I was challenged to talk to you guys about today is something that I think is more time for something completely different to the rest of what we're dealing with, which is the very nitty-gritty day-to-day challenges of technology for nonprofits in Australia in the current climate. And what I've been asked to talk to you about is actually thinking afresh about the way that we think about technology and the way that we could use it to engage with the people that we work with and for. The title is, or the subtitle is, a provocation in 3 parts, and that's because I fully intend to recruit you through this talk. I expect everybody to finish listening to this or to leave the room later on today feeling completely convinced of the 3 principles that I'm going to share with you and raring to go to apply them in their work. And so if that hasn't happened by the end, then see me and let me know what more I could have done. So here are the 3 parts. The first is to think about design first. Start there. Don't start with the solution. The second is to think differently about technology. Just completely wipe away the assumptions that you make and start from a very open questioning basis. Think differently about technology and engage your service users where they are using inclusive technology. So that's a lot. Think about design first, think differently about technology, engage your service users where they are using inclusive technology. We can boil it down a bit more. So let's just design technology to engage your service users. That's really where we're going with this. But it starts with those 3 big pieces. So let's take them one by one. The payoff, I promise, will be that it will completely change the way that you engage with your service users and that your whole business feels and runs. It will even change the whole balance of power in what you're doing for the better. So the other thing I want you to bear in mind as you go through is to understand that the problems that you're dealing with as you're asking questions in your work, and we did a masterclass earlier this week, and it became very clear that in many cases the technology problem that people are bringing to these events is not actually a technology problem. It's fundamentally a design and a human problem, and I want you to bear that in mind as we go through. So let's start with design, and I'm actually going to start by telling you a story. By telling you how I got to here, how we got to here, and some of the sort of exploration that we've gone through. So Frontline SMS is a piece of free open source tech, software that was created originally in 2005 to support small organizations, usually in low-income countries with low infrastructure, to send, receive, and manage SMS. By 2005, mobile technology was really racing through for example, Africa, and even in relatively remote places, you would see the mobile masts going up and the airtime sellers' shacks being painted red and green. And it was obvious that this was changing the way that Africa was doing business, and that in many ways, Africa and Asia were leapfrogging the West in terms of how central mobile was becoming to the way that life ran. And Kenya is one of probably the best examples of that. This photograph was taken in Kenya in Frontline SMS's Nairobi office the morning that we launched a new version of our software. It was an interesting day, but a successful one. So Frontline SMS is, as I say, free open source software. You could download it to your computer and use it with a phone or a modem to send and receive SMS. And people used it for all sorts of things. I'll give you a few examples in a moment, but basically we never focused on one sector. We felt that we wanted to support people in their work, whatever that was. The phrase we used to use was, we've never monitored an election or run a clinic, but you guys have, and we want to help you do that. This is the software, and over the 10 years since, it's done pretty well. This is actually really old, this figure. I think it's probably now closer to 4 or even 500,000 users, but definitely it's been used in at least 190 countries. And there's now a cloud-based version, which this is a picture of, which runs on AWS, for those who are interested. And there is a tiered subscription model, so that you can send more messages faster and do cleverer things with it. So this is where actually SimLab came from, my organization came from. Originally, we were the institutional home for this software. And we worked for years to support users like NMEM, who were one of our breakthrough users. In 2008, they monitored the Nigerian election, and it was written up in some of the Western newspapers. And it was one of the first really breakthrough uses of what we call mobile for development, or M4D platforms. And it made Frontline SMS probably one of the best known pieces of technology in the space. So we had a particular focus on the way we would do things. We would make a software that was as easy to use as possible, that was free, that you could just download and install, and away you go. I remember being really happy because a user in Tanzania told us that he'd gone from downloading the software to being up and running and sending text messages in 14 minutes, and that made us really happy. We would provide user documentation and case studies and blog posts and inspiration, and try and basically get out of the user's way. And we had some success. So NMBM used Frontline for many years. Kopaviv Haiti, these ladies are work on domestic violence issues, and they support survivors of domestic violence to get help and legal support. And this lady is the head of a relief committee in Isiolo, Kenya, who is being supported by the truck you can just about see behind her, with an aid distribution. So this is from 2012, when there was a drought in the Horn of Africa, and ActionAid were distributing food items. And traditionally what would happen is that organizations would just turn up when they were due to turn up, and villagers, people in the relief committees, wouldn't necessarily know when that was. They'd know roughly what day. So people would assemble and wait for hours. They'd put their lives on hold and come and wait in often really quite unpleasant conditions for this food distribution to turn up. In 2012, Info as Aid, which is an organisation that was a short-term initiative to help humanitarian work to benefit from some of this thinking around communication, set up two-way text message communication with these relief committee members. As a result, this lady knew exactly when the food distribution was going to arrive, and people were able to show up, at the right time rather than waiting around. And it actually completely changed the balance of power in this relationship, such that Isiolo, shortly after this visit, I think, became quite insecure. And the villagers in one particular place had to flee. They couldn't stay where they were, so they upped sticks and moved. And when they got there, they texted ActionAid and said, hey, please bring the next distribution to this new location. And they did. That doesn't sound like much, but in the traditional relationship where aid recipients are very passive, that is a huge transformation. And indeed, in a lot of our work, when we see these communications mechanisms being set up, we see a difference in the way that people who are receiving help see themselves and see the relationship, even to the point where people report feeling a sense of responsibility for the service itself, and feeling that they are as much a part of the team keeping it going as the team that are working on it. So that's a really powerful, positive thing. And these stories are repeated country after country, time after time, for 10 years. At some point in there, we started to feel like we weren't seeing the kinds of innovation or the kinds of data, certainly, but almost sometimes the kinds of payoff, the kind of ultimate success story that we wanted to see. So, for example, this worked really well, and we had anecdotal data that this organization were also using Frontline SMS to send, receive, and manage their management information, so M&E, monitoring and evaluation information. But we wanted to see people do more than that. We thought this would be really powerful for staff and volunteer management. In a place where there's no management data, can you imagine not knowing how many volunteers you have or what they're doing? This is the situation for many volunteer-led organizations in low infrastructure environments, and we felt that SMS could change that. So we started building a little bit more hands-on help. So we became available for usually international organizations, to hire us and send us overseas to work directly with local partners to help set up some of these things. And we got more and more uppity and opinionated about how this should work. And over time, we started to develop sort of best practice and trainings, and those could be quite useful and interesting for people. We conducted them. This one is in Kenya in 2012. This one was later in India in 2014. Those who were at the masterclass that I ran on Wednesday this week here in Melbourne would recognise the stick figures and the hats, which I insist on. But we ran this one in, I think this is Tanzania, and this is the dog in Tanzania who definitely wanted in on the training. So we started to sort of try and do some of this, I guess, design thinking. We never really knew what you'd call it. We just had this process where we would take people through, okay, so what are some of the communications channels that are available here? Who do you want to talk to? What do they already use? And what's the information you're trying to get across? And then figure out a way to put one with the other and make it work somehow. And in doing that, we came across, whole lists of things that we were coming up with that were things to think about. So data security and gender sensitivity and things like that. And we've been compiling all this knowledge for years. Well, imagine our surprise years later when someone told me it was called human-centered design, and that a lot of the processes and the exercises that we had developed over years of time just trying to figure out how to do this with organizations actually had a name. This is the very excellent IDEO field guide to human-centered design, which I recommend. But it's this design thinking. It's starting with the question, not the answer. It's not assuming that you know what's going to be the best fit for the situation that you're in, and then going through a process that takes you from a series of sort of foundational questions to identify, what is the real question here? What are the series of questions that lead us to the right solution? It's not always easy to do this. So we've always prioritized ease of access, and we were all about lowering the barriers to using technology for your work. So we would identify that cost was a barrier, for example. So if you were asking people to text you, then the incentives to do that had to be quite high for people to put their hand in their pocket or even to spend the time texting you. So people won't do so on a whim usually. It's not necessarily a particularly hot trigger unless there's some kind of incentive involved. The other thing that we've learned is, when you remove that barrier, we have seen that actually that can create problems for sustainability. So if you make text messages absolutely free to send in, what happens? Everybody sends in text messages. The value of the text messages goes down because people are sending maybe information that's less critical, or even sending like junk messages because they can. And the volume goes way up, and then you have to manage it. We actually had this happen recently in a project that's 2 or 3 years old that maybe, now, knowing what we know, we would have done it differently. And do I have a picture of that? Yes, I do. So this is Hargeisa in Somaliland, beautiful Hargeisa. This is a view across the city from near the airport. And we were working with an organisation called Health Poverty Action, who did a fantastic thing. They had an SMS feedback mechanism. So people who are using their clinics could text them and say, oh, this clinic was closed when it should have been open, or we have a suggestion, or whatever it was. And they actually found that people weren't texting them, and they were concerned that this was because of cost. So they created a toll-free voice number. So this number that you see here on the poster, you could call that number, and it went straight through to a phone that was held by the community feedback officer. That person's job was to run the feedback mechanism, so to popularize it, make people aware of it, and to go and empty the suggestion boxes once a week, and to write up all the feedback, give responses to everybody who'd given feedback, and then make sure that the things that needed to change, got fed up the chain into the management of the organization. As soon as this phone number went live, she spent all her time on the phone. So her job sort of became very, very busy. And when the program started her job was funded by the pilot funding that we were funded by to test this mechanism, not by the core funding for the project that she was working on. And in fact, the project funding was ending anyway. But when they were looking at how to renew the funding, how to keep that position in post, they weren't looking at something that was, I don't know, 45 minutes of someone's time every day, or even, 15 minutes in the morning, afternoon, and evening to check the text messaging and reply back. And we hadn't automated it successfully. It was hours and hours and hours on the phone and transcribing feedback from one spreadsheet into another. So although the design for the beneficiaries, for the aid recipients, for the people giving feedback was excellent and worked quite well in the end in some ways, in fact, where we fell down on the design was the sustainability in-house. So we're still learning, and we're still applying all of that learning in every new solution that we try to find. But that's what feedback loops are about. So you live and learn, and I think that's one of the things about design thinking is you have to have these feedback loops so that you inform your practice as you go along. So over time, we have developed this kind of big list of things to think about. And I've been telling some people here at Connecting Up that we have an assessment, a sort of context analysis framework that will be coming out. The main challenge I have is how you boil down all this stuff to think about into something that is more actionable than just a list of things to think about, a list of questions. So how do you weight these different questions? How do you phrase them in a way that is useful? So I'm having to do some design thinking of my own so that I know that if I give you a tool, it's not a nightmare to wade through and you can't really figure out what's more important than what, but something that's actually really easy to apply in your work. In the meantime, though, what we have published is a monitoring and evaluation framework. M&E, very, very big in international work, which, as you can see, is still quite a lot of what we do, although I'm going to come to some more domestic examples soon. And one of the things that people need is to have a way to really evaluate projects with technology in them in a way that gets to some of the things that are special or different about technology projects. So we developed these criteria for the truly nerdy among you. They are adapted from the OECD DAC criteria. And these are the 6 of them: relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, sustainability, and coherence. And I've got very brief summaries of them. Essentially, relevance is how far you've chosen the right tool for the job and the right approach for the organization that's implementing. Effectiveness is how well you rolled it out, how well you did the training, how well the technology itself worked, how well the platform worked, and how well whether you chose the right communications channel as well. Efficiency is sort of trying to establish what the outcomes, sort of looking more at the outputs of it. So did you save any money? Did you save any time? And understanding, maybe looking at the data and seeing what was the case before, what's your baseline, and then what's the change afterwards. So really trying to understand what the impact was at that kind of basic output level. Impact itself is a broader concept, which is around what the ultimate outcomes were of the work you're doing. So it includes looking at were there unintended consequences to what you did? So an example of an unintended consequence is the design mistake that we made in Somaliland, where the outcome was a very, very busy community feedback officer. So that's something that you would raise in the evaluation as an unintended consequence. Another one might be if you set up a feedback mechanism, but it only worked for say men and not women, and so or for people of a certain income level and not people on a lower income, and so the feedback you were getting was more tailored to people who are less vulnerable, and therefore the service, as you adapt it, becomes more appropriate for them and less appropriate for people with less. So those might be unintended consequences that you might look at. They also, here we look at as well at whether you've defended the data ethics and the legal rights of the people whose data you're messing with. And then sustainability, I've sort of mentioned that, is if, at the end of the day, is the project going to live on? Have you built something that needs specific funding to keep going? Or is it a part and parcel of the way that the organization does business? Has it offset other costs? Is it going to keep going? These are just some of the design. You can spin these and look at them as design parameters for the project that you're running, so you're planning. So we need to be thinking about sustainability. We need to be thinking about unintended consequences. We need to be thinking about whether something is going to be efficient and effective. And then the final one is coherence. So one of the things that we look at here is whether the software plays well with other pieces of software. So does it create big data sets that would be very interesting to other providers or healthcare providers or the government, but which aren't compatible with their data standards? Can you even get at the data if it's a proprietary platform? If it's open source, is it something that's got a broad group of people who are working on the software, and does it make sense as a project that you've contributed to? Those kinds of questions. And in terms of market, is this something like, for example, I would say developing an app for a phone that's not a smartphone is a very questionable thing to do, because it's hard to see how that would have sustainability in the long run. I would argue developing an app for a smartphone is actually hard to argue for in these days of mega platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and indeed the internet. Why don't you just make a mobile website? So it's those kinds of considerations. What's the sort of most effective thing you could do that will have the best benefit for not just you, but the ecosystem within which you operate? So that's just to give you an idea of some of the things we look at when we think about the design questions in our project. This sounds like a lot, but really what it comes down to is those three questions. Who are you talking about? What do they use? How can we harness that and help them to access you, and for you to access them through those channels? It's about choosing the right type of technology in the right way, to roll it out thoughtfully and well, and make sure that you can keep it going without massive continued investment. Those are the things I tend to look at. So that's the design thinking story that I've learned from years at Frontline SMS. And it's important to say that in 2014, we made the decision to spin out Frontline SMS as a separate for-profit company, which is still run by the same team, but they're just in a separate company now. And so SimLab can focus on being more independent. We focus more on the end game, the project, and we are platform agnostic. We don't use just one piece of software. We'll use anything that works. And we also don't just use one kind of technology channel. We don't just talk about text messaging or even mobile anymore. The question is finding the right technology channel for the right thing at the right time. So to move on to this question of technology, and this is a completely different headspace. So remember, there are three different provocations that I have for you. This is the second around technology, and it's a bit of real talk. Yesterday we heard some really good news stories about how the digital world is changing, how the younger generations are using technology in different ways, in ways we will never understand because we're already too old, and will at best be able to glimpse into what our young sisters and daughters and granddaughters are doing with the technology that they have in their hands. However, I am here to put the kibosh on your celebrations around that. So I went looking for some research on what the state of the digital divide is in Australia, expecting to see what I see in every high resource, high infrastructure country, which is that there are a lot of people who are left out. And that indeed is the case. So there are more people online now than there ever have before, but the people who are still offline are the most vulnerable. There are 4 million Australians as of last year who are offline. Actually, it's the same number as the UK. In the US, it's 60 million. And those people include the most vulnerable in our society, the oldest, people living with disability, people leading chaotic lives for one reason or another, and people in areas with very low infrastructure. So, yeah, 1 in 5 Australians apparently are not online. And I just actually stole this wholesale because I think it just has such wonderful images in it. All of this is taken from the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. They published a discussion paper in September last year. I have a copy, or you can Google it. I recommend it. It's very, very readable reading. And they confirm there is still a deep gap. There are a large number of vulnerable people who don't have internet access. 4 in 10 of the lowest income households in Australia are not connected to the internet. So that number of sort of a certain percentage of households, it gets higher if you look at only low income brackets. If you're looking at education levels, if you're looking at people who are older, if you're looking at people who are disadvantaged for one reason or another, all of those numbers go up in terms of the numbers of people who are offline. And in these times, that is a serious disadvantage, particularly when, as nonprofits, we don't have necessarily the budgets or the time to think about more expensive forms of being in touch. So we tend to go web. In fact, many of us probably have had apps developed. And I think we need to be very clear on who those apps are going to reach. They're not going to reach the people who are the most vulnerable. And when I look at this list, Australians born in non-English speaking countries, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households, people who are older, people with lower education levels, people who are homeless. These sound very much like the beneficiaries, the recipients, the service users of the organisations that I've met at the Connecting Up conference. And there are three things that the Australian Digital Inclusion Index points to as things that are necessary for digital inclusion to happen. One obvious one is access, and there are lots of organisations who try and support access to these digital goods, and indeed affordability. So they try to make it easier to get to these technologies, and also to be able to have maybe subsidise them so that families on low incomes can afford them. There's a third thing, though, that is very important, which is digital literacy. We spoke to an organisation in the US called Everyone On, who've been running this Connect Home program for a while, which basically does that. It goes into very disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and it provides a home internet connection. In terms of meaningful use of the internet for specific things, those numbers were still very low in some households, and they looked at how could they bolster the access work they were doing with work to increase digital literacy. And they found that, what's on the screen here. So at an income for families of 25 to 30,000 US dollars a year, you can definitely come up with some clever stuff to help people to learn how to use the internet and use it safely. And young people are often very helpful there as well, because they maybe have been exposed to that through school or friends. At $15,000 to $25,000 a year income, that gets harder, and only some of the strategies that they employ work. And anecdotally, what they've told me is that under $15,000 a year income for a family, it's really hard to build digital literacy. You're really sort of dealing with lots of other overlapping issues that make it very difficult, and just transforming access isn't going to cut it. So this is not necessarily something that is going to be a quick fix for these disadvantaged families, for people who are struggling with other issues in their lives. Just access isn't enough, and we're not going to be able to assume that what we always assume, which is, well, everyone's going to have a smartphone eventually, and this stuff is just going to happen on its own. It may do, but my contention is, I believe there are always going to be some people who don't have access to these technologies. I quite often talk about what's an inclusive technology. Well, for us, we say it's anything that's affordable and accessible and usable to the people you're trying to talk to at a given time. If you want to include everybody in this room, I suspect email would be the best thing, be the thing that everybody would be able to pick up. It seems like Instagram's a favorite, so that would probably be a close second. Obviously text messaging would be quite popular, right? But it's slightly more expensive, so why would you do that if you have to? So you go to sort of this combination of the most cost-effective thing that reaches most people. In the US, certainly, I don't know if about here, but if you go out onto the street, you're not even talking about text messaging. In the US, in contrast to the UK, it's quite expensive to keep a SIM card running all the time. You have to pay a monthly fee to keep the thing working. And people can't always do that. You also have to register with an address, and people may not have an address. So it really, if you want to reach everybody who is on the street outside my office in Washington, D.C., you would have to go up and down and talk to people. You couldn't even put posters up. So you can't make assumptions about what's going to work. And if you do, you're going to be ending up to miss people. By failing to offer inclusive channels and inclusive ways to be in touch with people, to access services, to hear from them, for them to ask you questions, for you to ask them questions, you're not just failing to include them, you are excluding them, and thereby you are causing them harm. So that's a lot to deal with, and a bit negative. So let's turn to something a little more positive. So where can we go from here? What do we do now with this information? You can come up with really clever ways, basically, to engage your service users with inclusive technology. There is a clear opportunity, which we are all not taking, to engage service users and communities with the technology they already have in their hands, whatever it is. You just have to go out and find out what it is. Give you some examples. And again, just to give you that definition, we bang on about inclusive technology all the time. We did make that up. I apologize. But what we mean by that is affordable, usable, accessible technology to people where they live right now. It doesn't have to be highfalutin. It could be a loudtailer. It could be a notice board. It could be suggestion boxes. It could be radio, which is still the world's most widespread communications mechanism. These are all inclusive technologies. So to give you some examples of where this has worked, in Oklahoma, way back in 2008, they were running a domestic violence shelter that I still don't know where it is because they still have to be careful to say who they are for security reasons. But they trialed an SMS helpline, which added to the existing voice-based helpline that they already had. Before they did this, they were getting 500 calls a month. They had 7,000 total clients in 2007. And they scraped together a $2,000 pilot budget, downloaded Frontline SMS with the help of a sort of techie person who lived nearby, and set it up. And once they'd done that, they suddenly got more text messages than was the official incidence for domestic violence in the county. People we didn't even know about were coming forward asking for information about domestic violence. They had a really clever thing which let women report what was happening to them without it going into any record or being passed on to the police. So they would just hang on to the text messages, but women could say, this happened to me today. It's a really important psychological step for people who are surviving domestic abuse. And ultimately, many of those women did go to the police, and there were 18 convictions in the first year from that data. That's really powerful. The actual cost was about $600. The tragedy is that I don't think this service lasted very long because they couldn't get more funding to keep it going, and things are on that much of a shoestring. But you can see how powerful that is. They got more text messages than they knew to expect. They got many, many more than phone calls, and they got 18 convictions from the data. This is the right technology in the right place at the right time. And if you think about it, it makes sense. So, if you're at risk from someone who lives in your house, it is silent to send a text message, and you can delete it once it's sent. So that makes it super safe. It's also psychologically less difficult to send a text message than to call up a human being and ask for help. So this makes total sense. So that's one example. Another one, in the Mississippi Delta this time, a group of charter schools wanted to engage the parents of the teenagers that they were supporting to make college decisions. They were getting access to the teenagers every day at school, but they were still making kind of iffy college choices, and they wanted to figure out why this was. So they figured out that if they could get to the parents and help them to give them frameworks and advice on how to help their kids make those decisions, then that would be very positive. So they decided to do that through SMS, and we helped them to put together an RFP. We went through a process very similar to the one that we took people through in the session the other week, where we went through who are the users of this system, what do they need, what do they use, what would be a good workflow for the system, a good process for all these messages to go through. So, they get written by whom, and then what happens, and then how do they go out, and how do people reply, and what happens to those replies, and so on and so forth. And then what does that mean in terms of what tool you need? So then we put together an RFP, a request for proposals, and put that out. And actually they ended up using Frontline SMS, which I promise we had nothing to do with, but they're now up and running, sending text messages to parents of the children that they support. This is actually from Kiev. This is me trying to figure out what was the most appropriate technology. And we managed to get a really useful report on the communications ecosystem. And you can see there's a big split between urban and rural. I would expect to see that everywhere. You can see that in the urban areas, people might have access to the internet. They might use social media. They have TVs and phones. They can send text messages. They get newspapers. Obviously, there's the opportunity to do community organizing. That's what that loudspeaker thing is. And then obviously they can accept phone calls. In the rural areas, the internet is a no-go. And actually, what we found out is that only 49% own a television, and there is a real discrepancy between the number of people in the urban areas and the rural areas who actually send text messages. Most people send calls. Could be a literacy issue, could be expense, could be cultural, not sure. But it's important to find out where people are. So then we ordered these in the order of sort of the most accessible, and advised the implementing partner to stick at that right-hand end. So word of mouth, community organising, using existing community-based organisations and networks within the community. The Rionka is actually the name of the newspapers, and they are very, very big news. Everybody reads the classifieds, so that was a huge outlet, and they should definitely be doing some communications through that. And you can make that two-way by giving a phone number where people can call up if they have questions or needs. SMS would be sort of so-and-so successful, but we felt there would be a problem with people in rural areas maybe not being so likely to use it. And there we really thought you should stop, because TV is expensive, and if it's not going to reach a lot of people in the rural area, then you're really going to be leaving them out. But if you wanted to do an urban focus campaign, and because if your urban areas are targeted, and because it's so low cost, you could actually run a little social media campaign without hurting anybody. It would be relatively low cost to implement, so we said, why not? So these are the kinds of design processes we go through. It's non-scary. It's really easy to do. You just have to take the time to do it and make sure you really understand what people are using. And the way to do that, by the way, is just to ask them. This is one more example from us, which is the DC Public Library. This is called Big Friendly. It was designed by our head of technology, Keith. And basically, we had to find a way for, and this is just showing you what inclusive technology can include, we had to find a way for librarians to be able to give information to people who came in asking for it. So this is very often older people. They came in with a problem. They didn't know who they needed to talk to about it. And we set up a system whereby the librarian could ask 4 or 5 diagnostic questions, and that would produce this packet, which would be several pages, actually. This is just the top of the first page. It would lead with the most important stuff. So if there was any mention of eviction, it would immediately say, you must call legal services for the elderly. Here you go. This is aimed at older people. And it would have contact details and information and so on, but a little bit tailored to the situation the person was reporting. It was appropriate technology because the librarian could go through this 5-step process and print off a thing really easily without getting into a lot of what they called life stories with people, because they weren't supposed to do that. They're not social workers. And give them something that even if the person maybe didn't read so well, they could find someone who could help them, and they could leave with something tangible, having had really good advice from the library. So basically, it doesn't always have to be text messaging. That's probably not right for everybody, for everything. You could look at radio and meetings and posters and WhatsApp and Facebook and Snapchat, depending on who you're trying to talk to. The point is to get out there and figure out what people are using and make sure that there's something available for everybody. Particularly be watchful for those who are most vulnerable, and make sure you've come up with something that they can use. So if you know, for example, that there is a group of people who don't have a phone, who don't read and write that well, who need to find a way to contact you that is really with almost no barriers, then maybe think about a drop-in, like a surgery or a clinic, so people can actually come and talk to you. And if distance and travel is a barrier, it's got to be a mobile drop-in. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get to everybody, and that's just the truth. So this is sort of where we end up. We end up really actually arguing for a lot of on-the-ground organising. It ends up not being technology at all. If you remember that slide from the beginning, your technology problem may not be a technology problem at all. And very often what we're talking about looks a lot more like organising or community mobilisation work. So it's also worth remembering that we don't all use the same thing for everything. We do use different things at different times. Maybe for certain types of things, it's nice to have a letter. For other things, you're happy to have a text message or an email. Sometimes you want to use like a quick platform to just sort of send a message, and sometimes you want to write something a bit longer. Sometimes you want to talk to somebody. So the other reason to have lots of channels open is so that people can use different things at different times for different reasons. And particularly if you're in seasonal work or you're in crisis of some sort, remember that people's habits change, whether under duress because they can't charge a smartphone, which means that you have to assume people won't have smartphones in emergencies because the battery life is so low, or just because they're sort of having to sell assets, for example. People used to have a laptop, now they don't because they had to sell it because they were on hard times. That's an example of a changing digital repertoire. It's not all bad news, though. That means that you can still identify lowest common denominator technology that most people use. And we would argue, for example, that text messaging and voice calls are 2 of those. So young people in America, this is Pew Internet Research Center, which does fantastic work. They send still more text messages than any other age group, and more text messages than anything else, still. Even though technically SMS is dying and we're not doing it anymore. Actually, we are. The reason is everybody uses text messaging. They can use the same thing to contact their grandmother, their mother, their friends, their teacher, whatever. And that's very powerful. So an example of someone harnessing this DoSomething.org, which is a sort of activist organization for young people in the US, started doing text message marketing. So people would, send a phone vote in for Justin Bieber or something like that, and they then have that text message, and they do a little bit of marketing, find out a little bit more about them. If they ask their zip code and their school, then they'd have actually some insight into socioeconomic grouping, and they could target advice and support as well as market research. It became quite a very successful SMS-based program in the US, which is quite rare. But in some of this conversation going back and forth, they began to get questions for help, asking for help. Some of them were really heart-wrenching. You can Google this story. This is the illustration from the New York Times story from February last year, that this young woman was really asking for help. And they figured out that not only was text messaging a good way to reach people, it was a really good way for people to ask for help. This is the same thing the Oklahoma Domestic Violence Group found. So they set up Crisis Text Line, which is a way for young people to be able to text and get help quickly. That's all it is. It's very powerful, and that was a real pivot. And actually, the founder of Do Something has left Do Something to go and run Crisis Text Line. You should read up about it. It's a really great service. Again, I would say, though, it's not all good news. Yes, it's a huge opportunity, but it is also really, it's incumbent on us to do this thinking. It's incumbent on us to look at the services we offer and ask, if someone needed this, how would they access us to access it? If someone had feedback for us, how would they give it to us? Are we really just offering a website and not much else? Are we just offering a website and a drop-in clinic? And if you're not mobile, what does that mean? How do you get in touch with us? Is there an easy way to send a text message or a phone call? Are we on Facebook? Are we opening all the channels up? Are we thinking about this from a design perspective? Are we involving our service users in the design of the communications channels that are opening to them? So again, it's very simple. Start with, who are you trying to talk to? Go and talk to them, get them in a group together and find out, what do they use? What do they use it for? What types of things do they do? And what would they like? And how can we make that work? And then start thinking about all the things around sustainability and data ethics and all the stuff that we talked about. And again, we will be putting more and more tools up on simlab.org. I can't promise that they won't all sometimes be a little international in flavour, but we do try to make them work in the US, the UK and Australia, as well as and other high income countries, as well as overseas. So so that's the provocation. Think first about design, challenge the way you think about technology and the way that your service users use it, and then seize that opportunity. Go out and engage your service users where they are using inclusive technology. So design technology to engage your service users. Whoops. And it will definitely improve your business. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.